Welcome to the CLASP podcast, where we spotlight Caribbean-led climate philanthropy and strategic partnerships. I'm your host, Durval Bazi. Today, I'm honored to welcome Cherisse Braithwaite-Joseph, Chief Executive Officer of the Cropper Foundation in Trinidad and Tobago. Cherise has over 14 years' experience in sustainability, disaster risk reduction, community development, and environmental management. As the recently appointed CEO of the Cropper Foundation, Cherise is leading efforts to ensure that people-centered development and environmental sustainability go hand in hand. Her leadership is shaped by a lifelong commitment to community-driven, data-based solutions that bridge policy and action. While the Cropper Foundation is sometimes viewed as a funder, at its core, it is a program-centered organization with a small strategic grant-making portfolio. Welcome to the CLASP podcast, Cherise.
Thank you so much, Durval. Thank you for having me.
So, Cherise, I want to start with your journey. Your experience includes working at the UNDP, the Environmental Management Authority, and the Association of Caribbean States. Can you tell us what drew you to this new leadership role at the Cropper Foundation? And also, how has your background in environmental systems and public policy shaped the way you approach climate action?
Thanks for that question, Durval. That's such a good, invitation to reflect. For me personally, I'm so honored to sit in the seat as CEO of Cropper Foundation. Having studied environment for years and being in the sector, I always joke that I've kind of been a bit of a stalker of the organization's work for years. And this role really felt like just a continuation of my career, but also where it would naturally evolve. I spent the better part of my career, as you would have identified some places, working in environmental management, compliance, policy, and in disaster risk reduction. And I did work in both public sector, private sector, intergovernmental organizations. And, moving into the civil society space seems like a natural evolution to really get the full picture of sustainable development. I've really always been interested in how science informs the decisions that we make that really affect people on the ground and communities on the ground. So in any role that I've been in, there's always been an element of people-centered development. When I was at the EMA, for example, I worked in the permit monitoring and complaints unit. So there was that element of taking complaints from the public and making sure that they were heard and they were actually actioned to improve the permits that were written by the EMA. At the ACS, there was a level of, diplomacy and making sure that projects that were built around what communities in the region needed. So what really drew me to Cropper Foundation was that it has that blend of technical elements and science with the grassroots participation. That's kind of the legacy of John and Angela Cropper. And in some spaces, that grassroots participation and inclusion feels like it's a contradiction to the science and to the technical elements, but at Cropper it's built into the mission, using science to drive participatory decision making. So I naturally feel very aligned to what Cropper Foundation stands for and what it was built around.
I love that point about marrying the technical and scientific elements with the grassroots, and I totally agree that is the approach that we should take in terms of not it being one or the other, but really working in tandem to achieve, shared objectives. So the Cropper Foundation is known for a strong focus on implementation, turning big ideas into action. So can you share a recent project that really captures how your work is helping communities in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean to adapt to climate change?
I would love to share an initiative that's recent. It's not specifically a climate adaptation initiative, but it is recent and it does speak to the narrative around climate change in the region. And that would be the Writing for Our Lives anthology, which was part of our Today Combo Tea project. We would have just launched that anthology this weekend, at the time of this recording, last weekend, at the Bocas Lit Festival. And I really do love this initiative because one of the challenges that you often hear in the Caribbean region is that our voices are not heard on international stages. The region is not unified in voice when having those discussions at those regional platforms. And the inspiration behind the anthology was putting faces behind the stories of climate change. So it's no longer just statistics of disasters. It's no longer just, numbers of inches of rainfall and wind speeds and sea level rises, actual influencing factors on the region that come from climate change. So the anthology was really created where we curated 18 stories from Caribbean writers that were resident in the region to really write creative writing, but also creative nonfiction on the actual lived experience of climate change in the region through essays and poems and stories. So it's really powerful because it's not just a book, it's really a regional movement of sorts where we talk about climate change and what the impacts are now, what we envision the impacts maybe in future, sometimes in futuristic worlds. And it really becomes this map of resilience and these narratives that challenge you to think about climate change in a different way and a more personal way. And it's something that's really at the heart of Proper Foundation, that sort of narrative building and using the arts to tell the story of development. And in this case in particular, the story of climate change and climate justice. So narratives and the narratives that we create and the stories that we build, those are the things that move hearts and those are the things that move decisions in the way that they should be to protect communities. So that's one of the projects I would love to highlight. The book is available for sale. However, it will be shared as an ebook soon. So I do hope that gets into the hands of decision makers and policymakers to really put a face behind the impacts of climate change.
Yes, and I want to encourage everyone listening to get their hands on the Writing for Our Lives anthology. I am so glad that I was able to attend the book launch at the Bocas Lit Fest, and I can't wait to dive into more of those stories. And I totally endorse that it's very important that we put faces behind the story of climate change. As you said, it's not just statistics. It's not just even a dollar value that we put to, the loss and damage that is being incurred. But it's real people, real lives, real stories that are being affected. So Cherise, your work sits at the intersection of social development and environmental sustainability. Can you tell us why it is so critical to link people's livelihoods and equity to climate resilience?
That's really the crucial question at the end of the day, right? Especially in our region, in the Caribbean. There's no way you can separate environmental resilience from livelihoods. Our region is so vulnerable and responsive to climate impacts and climate events that it really does affect all aspects of every livelihood, even directly or indirectly. Whether it's a fisherman dealing with changing ocean patterns, which leads to leads to the food security and the food baskets of the country, or whether it's just a family navigating how to live in a flood-prone area, or persons who maybe have not been in flood-prone areas before but are now suddenly faced with new impacts where they've lived their entire life and have put down roots. They may be displaced. So really climate change in that way, it really intersects with how people live, how people work, how people survive. So, at Proper, we really see sustainable development as being interconnected at its core. So environmental protection, economic opportunity, viable livelihoods, they're not in opposition in any way. They have to go hand in hand, which means that when we design projects and initiatives, there must be some space for inclusion and benefits of the communities, whether, economic benefits as well. So this really means that you have to support initiatives, and this is what we look at when we design initiatives as well, that they're multidimensional. So climate action, not just to tick a box, but also climate action that actually impacts the priorities of the region and the country in particular. So food security, climate impact on health. As I mentioned with the Writing for Our Lives anthology, there is an element of arts for sustainable development that is a major part of our programming at Cropper Foundation, because a large, sometimes overlooked element of climate impact is how it impacts our culture, how it impacts our national identity. So all of that, feeds into our national identity and how we see ourselves, but it also leads directly into livelihoods. So when we talk about, environmental sustainability and resilience, it's really what underpins society as a whole and therefore the sustainable development of it.
Whenever we're talking about sustainability, we have to take a holistic approach. Strong civil society partnerships are essential to driving long-term climate solutions. What have been some of the most powerful lessons that you have learned from these partnerships, and what would you say to funders who want to truly support and collaborate with local partners on climate solutions?
As I mentioned before, I've kind of bounced around in different sectors: private sector, public sector, intergovernmental, regional. And the biggest lesson I've really learned from being at Cropper Foundation, which speaks to the civil society, is that while in some places civil society is seen as the mechanism for delivery of initiatives, so you create these programs, you create these initiatives at a higher level in these spaces, and then they filter down to when they actually have to be implemented, and then you integrate civil society. The biggest lesson I've learned here is that civil society and those implementing bodies really need to be a partner from visioning, from the planning stages way early on. And some of the most, impactful interventions I've really been able to witness, not just at Cropper, but in other spheres as well, they really come from those small, locally based, community-rooted organizations who have that homegrown knowledge and that homegrown that information. And those organizations are really often asked to do a lot. And those organizations are often asked to do a lot with the least. And that it's an over-reliance on the civil society space for implementation when it's not, when it has not been involved from the planning stages and the visioning stages. And I think that's a lot of lost potential for how effective programs could be. So what also tends to happen is many small organizations, because of this gap, they tend to mold their own mandate to fit wherever funding is most available. And I feel like funders could really support better, not by just using civil society as the implementing, the executing bodies, but to really look and see how can we support these organizations who already know what the priorities are. They may already know who to go to or where to go to. Those connections already exist. It just need to be empowered and emboldened and funded. So I think the support could be better given through funding for the organizations, through core funding, but not just project by project by project funding. And it really will improve the sustainability of these initiatives so that we don't end up adding to the graveyard of pilot projects. And, by co-designing these projects that suit the local needs, instead of really prescribing them based on what is trending globally, and by listening, it really will result in more meaningful collaboration. So I think the biggest lesson, to come back to it, is that civil society is a partner. It's an expert, subject matter expert group in its own right. And it can't just be used as the implementers. It needs support as partners as well.
I think you answered my final question, but we're definitely looking forward to the Cropper Foundation supporting Carafil in mobilizing funders to sign the commitment to philanthropy for climate. Looking ahead to the Caribbean Philanthropy Forum in October, what message would you like to leave with philanthropic leaders?
That's a big question. So, I think the message I would leave, especially in these times that we have, is that this regional commitment is necessary. For way too long, our regional priorities have been defined by external priorities, and sometimes they align, but it is a missed opportunity to really have purpose built for purpose intervention. So, this moment that we're seeing globally with regards to funding shifts and changes, it really does invite the region to sit and be like, we know what we need. We have the expertise, and it's really for us to commit to like shifting that culture of from transactional to transformational, meaningful regional funding opportunities that really engage those partners from the beginning. So, my message would really be like, the Caribbean, we're not really waiting around, or we shouldn't be waiting around for what's trending or what the money is leading to, but we should be leading, and we are leading. Across the region, you find people building, food systems, new renewable energy initiatives, and, telling those climate stories. But, what we really need is that investment to honor that we are leading already. It's just we need some support in claiming that leadership title. So, I guess the message I'd leave is that the forum is really a chance to center those voices and center them in a way that it's not just you're in the conversation, and it's not just you're talking, but you're also part of the decision making and the planning. So just a reimagination of partnership and having that shared purpose and mission built to our region.
Thank you, Cherise, for such a thoughtful conversation and for reminding us that climate action is about big ideas, but it's also about rolling up our sleeves and working alongside communities, bridging the science and the technical elements with the grassroots, and moving from transactional to transformational. We are grateful to you and the team at the Cropper Foundation for showing us what's possible when strategy meets action.
Thank you, Durval. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm a big fan, as you know, as climate conscious as well. So, we're all doing our part.
Thank you. To all listeners, thank you for tuning in to the CLASP podcast series, where we celebrate the change makers driving a resilient and equitable Caribbean. Visit thecropperfoundation.org to learn more about their work. Explore the CLASP initiative at caraphilalliance.org/CLASP. Remember to subscribe to the Climate Conscious podcast and share this episode with a friend or colleague. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and do your part to build a sustainable future.